go ahead and start the meeting and thank everyone for being here. Stephanie, you already said I don't have to do roll call, right? Okay, if everyone will just say their name and their microphone. This is Chastity Dillard here.
Lou Tassinari here.
Amos Kiche.
Lauren Merritt.
Wangui Gadua.
Cliff Johnson.
And I'm going to say Chad Simmons is here as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll call into order. First, we're going to have the reading of the Native American Land Acknowledgements.
We meet today in the community of Iowa City, which now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The area of Iowa City was within the homelands of the Iowa, Meskwaki, and Sauk, and because history is complex and time goes far back beyond memory, we also acknowledge the ancient connections of many other indigenous peoples here. The history of broken treaties and forced removal that dispossessed indigenous peoples of their homelands was and is an act of colonization and genocide that we cannot erase. We implore the Iowa City community to commit to understanding and addressing these injustices as we work toward equity, restoration, and reparations.
Thank you, Commissioner Merritt. Again, I want to thank everyone so much for being here. We're so excited for our first event here for the Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I want to just go over a couple of housekeeping options. If you haven't got any food yet, we have some food in the back. If you need to use the bathroom or the restroom, it's going to be in this area towards the back. And if you have, if any of the information that we're going to go over today is you find troubling or triggering, we do have mobile crisis workers here. If they would like to come and just introduce themselves real quick to the microphone, we have that as well.
Hi there, I'm Elizabeth.
I'm Marga.
We're from the Mobile Crisis Response Team out of Community Crisis Services. We dispatch teams of mobile crisis counselors 24/7, 365, anywhere in Johnson and Iowa counties where a crisis is occurring. Crisis is self-defined by the individual, and a big mission of ours is to divert from excessive law enforcement and unnecessary hospitalizations. We can talk to anyone today that would want to talk. We also left cards in the back, so if anyone here wants to talk in the middle of the night, we'll send a team out, or friends, neighbors, family, anybody like that, let them know. We're always an option here in our community.
Thank you most for being here.
Thank you.
Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Dr. Larry Schooler, who's going to go over our topic of discussion tonight, our fact-finding things.
I really appreciate the use of jargon, Madam Chair. Well, I just want to start by saying that there's a joke at my synagogue that I'm a fashionista, which, as you can see, is not at all true, but now that I've facilitated at the right house of fashion, I think I should lay claim to being a fashionisto or something. But in all seriousness, I have to say that I feel a mix of emotion tonight because this could certainly be the last time that I'm here with you all to facilitate, and it's clear that there is a lot that has been accomplished and a lot that has yet to be accomplished. And I want you all to hear from me at the beginning and at the end how grateful I am to you for this opportunity, and how, I don't know if this sounds the way I intend, but how proud I feel of you for the hard work that you've done since I've been associated with you, these last 8-9 months. So I hope that as we have conversation tonight, that you take away how much power you have to make change, and see me as a supporter, no matter whether I'm sitting at this chair or watching you all from afar, that I'll continue to support this work, that I'll continue to champion it, and that hopefully you will feel as proud of yourselves as I'd feel as an observer of you. So I hope that doesn't come off too parentally. I do have young children, but the intention is to express my appreciation. So what I've done is I've outlined a plan for us tonight that is laid out on the agenda. And I want to make sure that for folks who are here who are not on the commission, that with the chair's permission, that you know that you have a platform. The truth-telling events are later this week, and those are the times when members of the public are being invited to offer testimony. But I think tonight is, we're in this wonderful space, and by the way, to Mr. Wright, and that sounds funny, Mr. Wright. But anyway, to Andre and to the Wright House, this is just a wonderful space to facilitate in. So thank you for letting us be in here. But I think it's perfect partly because it will hopefully engender within everybody a feeling that they can be part of the conversation. And so I'll do my best to keep an eye out for people's hands that are raised if they have a question or something that they want to comment on. I want to be mindful that this is the commission's meeting, and so it's up to the chair to determine how we're going to involve folks from the community. But I think it's important that people be able to offer their own insights into what it is that we're talking about. But while Thursday night was meant to be a presentation of information, tonight's really meant to be about a deliberation. So you're going to hear less from me up front and a lot more from yourselves, with the understanding that this meeting may only generate some preliminary consensus on this one topic, but that would be a win. And I fervently hope that I can gently guide you all in a direction where you come away on this topic feeling as if you have some shared understanding. So let me lay out the way that I've set up the agenda. I apologize, there we go. So we've got a little bit of new information, and I do want to acknowledge, even though it might embarrass her, Councilmember Laura Burgess, because not only has she been a steadfast supporter of this commission, of course, but she and I have gotten to work together to help strengthen the data that you all are reviewing on this topic, and that's very laudable and appreciated. So we'll look a little bit at some additional information from what we had already presented. We'll also talk briefly about what our standards should be for findings of fact. So what I mean by that is, it may seem a little philosophical, but I think it's important for this group to decide how they're going to deem something factual, and that it's not meant to be just a meta exercise. It's really meant to be something where you determine, okay, if I have one source for this information, then maybe I need a second source in order to confirm it, or maybe I need one source of a particular type and a second source from another type, or what have you. But I think it's hopefully, as Councilmember Burgess and I have talked about, a template of sorts as you go forward with other forms of fact-finding to be able to say, is what we're seeing here factual, or is it hypothetical, hypothesis, et cetera. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then chiefly the hope for tonight is that in advance of the truth-telling events, you take the data that you've received on this topic and come to some preliminary consensus on it. And again, when I was here in August, I think I talked about some of the ways I define consensus, and you may define it differently, but for me, consensus means that we've reached a decision point that all of us can support, or at least are willing to let move forward without opposing it. So it's a little bit different than a unanimous decision or a majority vote, certainly. It's designed to say, this may not be the very first choice that I have for our outcome, but I'm willing to live with it as representative of my core interests. So you'll see me, if I hear one person offer a suggestion and someone else push back, you'll hear me ask questions like, well, what would enable you to be able to support what you just heard? What amendment, what change would you want to see made to it? Or are you just not able to support it? Sometimes we use like green, yellow, red. You know, red means I'm not going to be able to support that at all. Yellow is kind of on the fence. Green is go forward. So that's a key outcome that I'm hoping you all will achieve, at least in part tonight, but mindful that the truth-telling that will happen later this week is, of course, going to enrich the conclusions that you can draw just from data alone. And so this will be preliminary, but it hopefully can be material that you then come back to as you develop your recommendations for action going forward. I don't know that I need to belabor the community agreements because I know you all are familiar with them. Obviously, it's important for us as a group to listen fully from our hearts, allow space for silence, avoid arguments, respect one person speaking at a time without interruptions and speaking from an I perspective from our own experiences, a community of learners who are growing, who takes responsibility if we're hurt by others' words. We use inclusive and non-gendered language and use each person's pronouns. We aim to build trusting relationships and know we move at the speed of trust, and we care for ourselves and each other. And we honor what others say with discretion and integrity, sharing only with context and in relevance to our own life and learning, not as gossip. So I mentioned to you when I was on Zoom Thursday night that I think it's important for this group to consider what fact-finding means to you and what makes something factual, and what standards should you use to identify a piece of information as fact. And so I briefly just want to revisit some examples from TRCs that have preceded you to give you a feel for how these other TRCs have gone about it. So the Greensboro TRC, as you know, looked at a mass murder, a shooting death of 5 individuals in 1979. And in order for them to collect data, they looked at things like internal police records, trial testimony, and newspaper reports. They ended up using a standard that they labeled either the balance of probabilities or the preponderance of evidence, because in a case like this, there were conflicting narratives. And so they ended up deciding that basically they would err on the side of something being reinforced by different sources, and if there were 2 sources in tension, was there a third source that validated one side or the other? And so they would ask a variety of questions, and this has a lot to do with the truth-telling side of things, but it also, I think, is relevant to fact-finding. So for someone who's testifying, they would ask, what was the person's ability to remember and relate details about the observation they're presenting? If asked in multiple ways, do they relate the details in a consistent fashion? Again, I think that applies more to truth-telling. Did the source hear or see the evidence directly, or is she or he reporting something they heard from somewhere else? Is there any noticeable bias toward any particular version of events? And that's, I think, important. Is the evidence consistent with other evidence from different sources? And is the evidence logical or reasonable? So I share this with you not to say it's the right thing or the answer key, but just simply a second opinion, an example from another TRC that was also looking at similar issues to what Iowa City's TRC is examining. The other 2 North American commissions that have met most recently, it's a little bit more complex, I would say. In Canada, you may know that they were operating with a federal mandate with an exceedingly large budget, so really a different scope of work. But there was a mandate in Canada to turn over certain documents that were related to the investigation, and we certainly haven't gone that far. We haven't taken anybody to court to, compel the release of any records. There also were private records like student records that relate to the boarding schools that the Indigenous attended against their will, as well as some other material that had previously been private. And you can see that there were over 100 categories of records or sources of fact found. And again, I guess what I would share with you there is someone's the official school history could have easily contradicted what someone said in testimony, because that school history might have censored or omitted key pieces of information. And so it's just important to consider what to do when the lived experience of someone may conflict with the data that's been presented. And then the main commission, which also dealt primarily with Native American populations, was looking at a variety of different forms of data, including the narrative or counter-narrative about the tribes there, tribal-state relationships, child welfare, incarceration experiences. So they were either looking at specific cases or these issues in general, as well as some national context, which I think applies to your all's work, because obviously what's happening in Iowa City is in some ways similar to what's happening in a lot of cities around the country on this particular topic. And then they looked at statistical reports that dealt with their particular topic, as we have here, training-related materials, which is something we haven't gotten into as much yet, although we've listed trainings that the police department has undertaken. The relationship between tribal nations or organizations and the state. We've talked a little bit about police departments in Coralville and Sioux City that have formed some interesting proactive relationships between police and community, and various other reports and recommendations. So this just deals with the way in which the facts that were collected were summarized, and less about the standards of fact. So let me return to the question that I put to you, which is, what standards should this TRC use to identify a piece of information as fact? And what I'm actually going to ask you to do is watch me open this package. It's absolutely riveting. What I'm going to ask you to do is use a pad, each person, one pad per person. And take one and pass it along. And you should have a pen at your disposal. Oh my, excellent. Leave one for Commissioner Simmons. What I want to encourage you to do is to do some initial writing. And the reason that I recommend this as a facilitator is that when we get into open discussion in any group, a lot of times one or two people say a lot and a lot of us say a little, and that's just human nature. But by writing something down as to your idea of what a fact-finding standard could be, we might find some common ground amongst us. We might find some interesting perspectives that we wouldn't have heard if we just had open dialogue. But hopefully it'll allow us to congeal around a shared idea for what our standard for fact-finding could be. So I invite you to take a couple of minutes, think about what you would want your standard for this group to be as it relates to delivering findings of fact when you deliver your final report. And once you're done, let me know and I'll collect them in one spot and we'll review them together. Would anybody mind if I read them out just so that we can, for efficiency's sakes? I think I became a PhD because of my handwriting, so no one has any handwriting on me. Let's see. Fact-finding, scientific professional research, as this fact-finding has been. Fact-finding means try and hear two sides to story, look up data to see if it matches, find the reason for whatever issues. Fact-finding standard, corroborated stories, reports, factual data backed by anecdotal data versus data sourced by oppressed communities. Triangulation, at least 3 independent, trustworthy sources agree, and evidence for a fact should be clear and convincing. Corroborate with similar testimony, video and audio footage. May have to acknowledge testimony as fact according to the truth teller, but not necessarily factual in the sense of a court of law. Seeking all information from all available sources that pertain to a particular issue or issues. Wonderful answers there. What did you notice as you heard your colleagues' responses?
Consistency, I think, was a big theme through all of them.
Consistency.
Yeah, I would agree. Consistency, it seems like we have different ways of defining things, so it seems like we could come to some agreement.
Multiple people talked about wanting some corroboration of a single data point to get some validation of it from a second source, I heard. What else?
I think we're also talking about the adequacy of the information.
Did you say the adequacy?
Yes.
The adequacy. Can you say more? What do you mean by adequacy?
Looking at all available sources that is out there without picking or selecting on some basis or some, either organization or something.
Well, I think it's an excellent point, and it's important for me to admit to you all that we had to pick and choose because of time and resources, and I think we've omitted plenty of material that could easily be germane to your work. So it'll be important as you continue to think about what's missing from what's been presented, because I can tell you for certain there is. There's no data here directly from, for example, the Johnson County Sheriff's Department or the University of Iowa Police because of time and available resources. So to Commissioner Guiche's point, this data may not be adequate by that standard. There may be more that needs to be gathered. Other reflections?
One thing I was thinking about is that it's going to be important to be able to write or to ask the right questions. You know, because depending on how something is posed, somebody's response may be very different because they may be looking at the question very differently than how it's intended.
Which is interesting to me for a lot of reasons, partly because when we were compiling information, I was trying to differentiate between any data around policing and data that was specific to the charter of the commission, which has to do specifically with racial inequity. So I think your point's well taken that there's plenty to be said about public safety in any community, but it's important to understand what you're expected to report on and should ask of people as compared to just the broader national conversation. Did you want to add?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
People's ideas also touched on how and where the facts were found. Yeah, from whom, from where, and how it was done. Yeah, we all seem to bring this out in our idea of fact finding.
To understand the source of the information, absolutely. Sources, I should say. Anything else anyone wants to add on this topic?
The only thing that comes to mind is just thinking about how this feels very on like a singular individual basis versus the larger community basis. As you go up the levels, like defining a fact just feels a lot different in my mind.
When you say go up the levels, you mean from individual to community?
Like a small, like local view to a wider view, which is the essence of like discovering racial injustice. So.
No, it's very challenging. I mean, it's what could be true and factual for one person of one race in one community could be entirely different for someone in a different community of the same race, even. So it's hard to make generalizations in that way. Well, I think that the answers you've given provide us as report writers for this phase enough to go on, and I would say that it's important for us to provide you with some language and then for you to continue to play around with it between now and when your report comes due and not treat it as etched in stone. And to your point, ask your community, you know, is this a standard that we should adopt? So what we'll do is, for your report in April, provide you with some of that preliminary language and then encourage you to get feedback and reconsider it as you go along. But I appreciate the conversation very much. So I want to ask, before I continue with some updated information, I know there are people here who may not have been at Thursday evening's presentation, and what I had planned to do was skip over slides that I covered Thursday night and focus only on the new information collected since Thursday night. And I know that we have handouts, so I think everybody has a handout. Chair, is it okay if for the time being I skip over those slides that were already shared Thursday night, or would you rather my review those as well?
I'm okay with skipping over so we can dive deep into it, but I'd like to ask the commission and see what they think about that.
I think it might be helpful if you could give just a synopsis
Sure.
of those.
An overview or something?
'Cause otherwise, the new information won't be in the right context.
Absolutely, yes. Let me, if you'll just permit me, I need to calibrate things in such a way that it will, it's like a game of hide and seek with my slides here. Give me 1 second. Apologies for the delay. Right. Okay. So, in summary, at the summary level, but I would say if there are questions, stop me as we go. We talked on Thursday night about the number of different sources that were used to compile the information that we presented to you. And again, I do want to call attention to the fact that there are at least double the number of sources available for information that's related to this topic than what you see there. And we only made choices based on how much time we had to prepare the presentation and how thorough we felt we could be with the resources available to us. But we looked directly to the police department, to the city manager's office, to federal data, to other police departments, to a couple of not-for-profit organizations that may be advocating for a particular kind of police reform but are still utilizing data sets to draw conclusions, and then St. Ambrose University is who compiled the stops and disproportionate minority context study for a number of different years. We talked briefly about how the police department compares to other departments in terms of its numbers, and the important piece of information here is really on this slide, which shows you that the Iowa City Police Department, in terms of sworn positions per capita, is smaller than not just the U.S. average and not just Midwestern cities with a similar population, but a number of other, what I'll call college communities, the so-called Big Ten communities, and 4 other larger cities in Iowa. So again, this is not a raw number of officers, but it's a proportionate number based on the population of the city. And then you'll see that the breakdown of racial backgrounds amongst the police department is similar to, but not entirely identical to, the makeup of the community here. And I have the slide, a couple of slides from now, that shows the demographics of, let me get to that. Apologies for jumping all over the presentation. This is the Iowa City population demographics from the Census Bureau. So you'll note that the purple represents the Black or African American population. The sort of tan represents the Asian population. The indigo is Hispanic or Latino. The small blue is American Indian or Alaska Native. So there are fewer, by percentage, there are fewer Hispanic police and Black police in sworn positions than there are people in the community who identify that way, and fewer Asian Americans who are on the police force that identify as Asian. There were some other information provided to us by the police department about the pace of applications, and I won't go over this in too much detail, but there's the applications that are received, there's the written test that's taken, there's physical fitness tests that people go through, there's an interview, and then there's finally the certified hiring list. And this actually is a little bit closer to the proportions in Iowa City. This is a combined number for about an 18-month or so period, starting, I think, in May of 2022 and going all the way up to last month. And these are people who are eligible to be hired in the Iowa City Police Department, broken down by race. This is very similar to that, so I'll keep moving. I did note in the presentation the other night about ways in which the ICPD is trying to continue to recruit officers in a way that gives them a little bit of a leg up on other police departments, including a bonus for those who have already completed the law enforcement academy, and flexibility on when people can submit their applications. We shared a little bit of information about spending on policing and noted that the Iowa City percentage of the overall budget used for public safety is a little bit lower than other similarly sized cities in Iowa, or for all cities taken in average. We also noted that the police department budget has risen from 2018 to 2024 on a steady basis, but at a relatively modest clip, with the exception of what's proposed from 2023 to 2024, which is a little bit elevated. But that is an illustration, the green line, of the budgets, and the red line shows changes in percentage year on year from one year to the next. We also looked at how police funding compares to investment in other forms of public spending, and how the per capita amount spent on policing is lower than a lot of the other departments that were examined in this particular data set that was collected by Police Scorecard. These arrest numbers and offense numbers are certainly noteworthy, because as you look at the percentage of arrests by race, you will see that Black or African Americans are significantly higher, more likely to be arrested than their percentage of the population would reflect, as much as twice as likely, based on the way that the population breaks down. So I'm looking at the second line. 8.5% of the population, 19% of the arrests, and there's a little bit of a jump for American Indian or Alaska Native. Hispanic or Latino is not counted or captured in this particular data set. These are a little bit more recent numbers that deal with stops, and it's important that we remind ourselves that we're not just talking about people who are arrested and convicted, but people who are stopped and maybe given a warning. And this comes from the study conducted by independent researchers. And as you can see again, when you look at the percentage of people stopped by race, you see that Blacks account for 18% of those stopped, but only about 9%, if I remember correctly, of the population. And Hispanic stops are about in line with the population size. And then the arrest numbers jump even more dramatically than that, where Blacks make up more than triple, more than 3 times the amount of, or 3 times more likely to be arrested than someone who identifies as white, according to this. I know that Commissioner Tassinari had asked for some block level data. We just didn't have the time to compile that, but we'll see if we can't before our final report. But this is a map that shows where more of the concentration of stops takes place in these 2 zones, one of which is very close to where we are right now, and another is a little bit further south. This is new information tonight that the chief was able to provide us as part of the budget process. This is a total of about 8,800 stops that he's accounted for in the year 2022. Again, you see that Black African American percentage is 3 times or more as high as the population percentage. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, if you want to continue to reference that population demographic, we've put that on slide 32, which is on page 16. I'll come to it in just a minute, but if you want to continue to have that in front of you, that's the demographics of the city population-wise, according to the Census Bureau. So again, with a population that is about 9% Black or African American, the stops are up to 3 times as high of a proportion. The chief did share that the number of stops in 2023 declined significantly, and he attributed that in part to a change in policy that I'll get to in just a minute. But this pie chart represents only about 5,000 stops total, but the percentages haven't changed very much. You can see still that the African American percentage is there around 27 or 28%. So I talked the other night about a policy enacted by the ICPD in 2020, which was designed to eliminate or limit stops based on some sort of jaywalking or other minor violation that didn't pose an immediate threat to public safety, or things like a cracked windshield or a tail light or window treatments and so on. And at the time, the chief said that this is in part because minority drivers often have a higher chance of being stopped than non-minority drivers, and they were hoping that this would produce a reduction in that disparity. But with help from Councilmember Burgess, we dug into a law passed at the state level in 2021 that became known as the Back the Blue law for perceived support for law enforcement, and it essentially keeps the Iowa City Police Department from having such a policy. It doesn't mean that on the street an officer can or cannot make a particular decision, but, and I'll look at Councilmember Burgess to make sure I'm getting this right, but essentially the city can't have a policy not to stop someone for any particular reason by state law. So, and as you can see, a local government can even be penalized if they were to adopt such a policy. So that policy that I talked about on the previous slide was undone by that state law. It's also really interesting that on my drive in today from Chicago here, I heard reporting on Iowa Public Radio about this pending bill. And I remember that Assistant City Manager Redmond Jones talked about this as well, that there is still a bill pending in Des Moines that would prohibit Iowa cities from having the kind of community police review board you have right now. It's my understanding that if this law passes, the community police review board that you have now would be eliminated. And it's, you know, certainly possible to go into a detailed conversation about the pros and cons of this bill, but I think it's just important to be aware of this dynamic, because it could play a role in recommendations you make as it relates to how the behavior of law enforcement should be reviewed. There was a quote in one of the news articles that I read that said that several of the civilian review, I think about 5 civilian review boards around Iowa, and that they started in response to racial profiling, according to the head of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP. So this is that demographics slide that I mentioned that's useful to come back to. And then these next few slides deal with a variety of different ways to measure the racial breakdown of police engagement with community members. And you'll see on nearly every pie chart that in comparison to the share of the population made up by communities of color, so that's 9% African American and 7% Hispanic, the number for warnings or for citations is higher for both groups, and in the case of black males in particular and black females, it's as much as twice as high as their population, if not triple. We talked a little bit the other night about differences between types of offenses, where the Group A offenses are the more serious. Group B are things like driving while intoxicated, liquor laws, drinking underage, and so on. So this is a community that, according to the last batch of data we had, has similar numbers of Group A offenses and Group B offenses. You see the number of arrests year on year for the last several that they had data for related to these different offenses, not broken down by race per se. And then we get into use of force incidents. So one thing to note here is you want to pay most attention to the blue, and the lime green is the number of times that there was a call for the police to come to a scene, and the blue was the number of time that force was used. They do count the display of a taser or a firearm as a use of force incident, or a firearm to euthanize a wounded animal gets recorded as a use of force. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they struck someone or shot someone, but even if they just displayed that kind of weapon. These next few slides show you the racial breakdown of how force is used, and it's clear that for black males, the proportion of times force was used is well in excess of how much they make up of the population. So if you combine the male and female, you get roughly 46% of the uses of force being used on black African American suspects, which is significantly higher. That's data for 2020, and this is data for 2021, which is does not change significantly. This is some new information, and it may be a little bit hard to parse because there's a lot here, but Chief Liston provided us with a breakdown of the type of call for service that resulted in a use of force by police. So what you can tell just by looking at it is that the most frequent call for service that resulted in a use of force was some sort of disturbance or fight that was in progress that may have led the officers to use force or display a weapon to get the people who were fighting to stop doing so. But this is broken down into quite a large number of categories. It's not broken down by race, but it is broken out in great detail in terms of the type of stop. So that I think was, I have to check with Laurel Cohen on this, but I think this first one might have been 2022 and this is 2023. I'll see if she can correct me on that. We then took a look at accountability, and that goes back to what I was talking about before on the Community Police Review Board and various forms of oversight. We showed you the other night that the Community Police Review Board has agreed with the chief's investigation findings most of the time. This is reflective of a 23-year period, but I'll show you in a second some of the context that it's important for you to have about the authority or the reach, so to speak, of the Community Police Review Board. This shows you the type of allegations that were made in Community Police Review Board complaints. And we talked about how a complaint could have more than one allegation. So that's why the numbers are a little bit skewed. You could have one complaint and every allegation listed here, for example. And then this bar graph shows you the number and category of allegations that were sustained based on the type of behavior that was alleged. I wasn't able to get additional information on the reason why there are so many more internal complaints or directed complaints on police than there are citizen. In other words, the top section is for someone from the public who files a complaint to say, I was mistreated by an officer. The bottom half is, I'm an officer in the ICPD and I saw something that I didn't think should happen. And as you can see, those numbers are far greater than the community, and we just didn't have time to get that question answered, but I'll try to get that for you before we submit our final report. But let me just quickly share with you what you may already know, which is how the CPRB, the Community Police Review Board, operates. They review a report that is prepared after the investigation of complaints about alleged police misconduct. So they don't necessarily conduct their own investigation. They're reviewing the investigation that has been completed. They then issue a written report with detailed findings of fact and conclusions that explain why and the extent to which a complaint should either be sustained or not sustained. And they also can weigh in on broader police policies, procedures, and practices and may recommend modifications to them. But they don't have any sort of power or authority over discipline. They can't discipline an officer. They can't vote and decide how an officer should be punished, and it's not functioning as a court of law or substitute for legal action. So I'm not saying that to denigrate them in any way, but I think it's important for you all to understand the limits that they're under, which may affect how many complaints they receive if people feel that they're not sure what will come of filing a complaint. And again, the state is considering a bill that could do away with the CPRB's existence altogether. Go ahead.
Who compiles that investigation, or who investigates and gives them the report?
Chief of Police is my understanding. The chief, the complaint can be made to the CPRB, but they wouldn't themselves conduct an investigation. Oh, there's someone here with a clarification.
Mandy, if you can come to the front and say your name, please.
Sorry, Mandy Remington. I'm completing my 4-year term on the Community Police Review Board right now. And we actually do complete our own investigation. That is after the chief completes an investigation. So first, the chief completes an investigation. We receive the original complaint and the chief's investigation. We then do complete our own investigation. We have access to body cam, we have access to dash cam, we have the opportunity to reach out and ask the complainant to come in and have a conversation with us. However, yes, we are very limited to only being able to sustain a complaint if there's an actual policy violation. And one thing that we often find is that there is something that happened that was unacceptable in a lot of people's eyes, but is not a policy violation. And so that is where that comment section on our reports comes in. That is something that I would highly recommend digging into. I've tried to take advantage of that section when I've written reports as much as I can to illuminate various things. So yeah, there's no disciplinary power, like you said, no legal authority, but we do have access to actual video camera and potentially to the complainant.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that. Yeah. We talked a little bit last time about the extent to which community members have specifically brought concerns about bias-based policing. Both were found to either be not sustained, meaning the review exonerated the officer, finding that their actions were justified, and in the second case, it had been another agency, not ICPD, that was involved. This has a little bit of updated information. It's very, very time-consuming to get all of the lawsuits filed against the city of Iowa City that may also include ICPD. And so what you see in front of you is a very small subset of those lawsuits. What we attempted to do was identify a few cases that were specifically relevant to your charge. And I do want to thank Chair Dillard. I'll talk about the case that you brought to me on the slide after. But here were two cases that we wanted to make sure you were aware of. The first involves a man named Anthony Watson, so Watson versus ICPD. He sued both Iowa City PD and Coralville's PD and 2 officers for negligence, false arrest, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious prosecution. That suit was settled by both cities for $390,000, and they each paid half of it. And he had been stopped for reckless driving, tested negative for both alcohol and drugs. The officers allegedly used kind of a subjective, like, he looks like he might be on drugs, as kind of a standard for determining that he was under the influence of marijuana. So there was no admission of wrongdoing by ICPD or the city, but the case was settled. And then this case that's actually partially still pending involving a man named Chris Kelly. He sued Iowa City and Johnson County for illegal racial profiling, racial discrimination, failure to intervene, etc. He was jailed for 8 months, and a federal judge released him when the judge said that the case amounted to a story of walking while black. That's a direct quote from the ruling made by the judge in this case. And the allegation was that perhaps the person, that Mr. Kelly was stopped based on the direction of a county prosecutor who thought that Mr. Kelly was liable for some other offense, and when he spotted him on the street, he apparently contacted a police officer to ask that he be questioned or detained. Mr. Kelly's lawsuit is, to my knowledge, still pending, but parts of the lawsuit that are related to racial discrimination were dismissed. But this is a case in which the plaintiff alleged specifically racial profiling. And I'll just mention that there is another case at the top of the list, the Tolston versus ICPD case, where racial profiling was also alleged, but that case was also dismissed. I shared this the other night. But in the case of Mr. Watson, the specific officers involved, including an officer who was captured on video forcing a teenage black male to the ground in a recreation center in 2015, that prompted an online petition calling for the end of discrimination against black youth, and a little bit of modification to procedures and policies to focus on de-escalation techniques. And then that same officer who had resigned from the ICPD was also investigated while at a different agency for seeming to, on video, differentiate between 2 suspects or 2 parties, one of whom was black and one of whom was white. He was placed on administrative leave but cleared of any wrongdoing. Again, he's still in law enforcement but not at the ICPD. And then, thanks to Chair Dillard, I did want to bring forward this other case. This did not produce a lawsuit, but it was the death of a Sudanese American who was living in Iowa City and was shot and killed by a Johnson County Sheriff's deputy about 15 years ago. The investigation conducted by the Attorney General found that the shooting was justified because Mr. Deng had stabbed someone and apparently refused commands to drop the knife. The witness testimony or the witness accounts were conflicting. Some said that he was, I guess, menacing in some way, others didn't. The media reports that came out about the case indicated that he might have been himself struck by the other individual before he struck back, and some even said that they weren't even sure he had a knife in hand or was threatening the deputy before being shot. And at a press conference after this, several speakers alleged that Mr. Deng's race played a role in how the deputy handled the incident. No lawsuit, to my knowledge, was filed in this matter, but it certainly is indicative of a concern on some people's part about racial profiling. If it's okay with Vice Chair Merritt, I'm not going to repeat the Coralville anecdotal material, but it's very interesting and it's there in your packet, as is the work that we were able to get information on with Stephanie Bauer's help about Sioux City PD. And then again, we were able to share a list of trainings undertaken by members of the Iowa City Police Department that are related in some way to your mandate. I believe that all of the trainings that you see here are required. Some may not be required by every single officer, but they're all required trainings, either for supervisors, non-supervisory staff, or the entire department. And I think we discussed this in depth as well. These are some of the things that we have yet to be able to find. I do think that it's important to look at the activities of the Johnson County Sheriff and the University of Iowa. It's just important to try to compare apples to apples, because obviously Johnson County patrols more than just Iowa City, and the University of Iowa PD only patrols a part of Iowa City. So it would take more time than I think we have to be able to do that. And there isn't, that we know of, although our friend from the CPRB might know this, we didn't find a breakdown of the race of people filing complaints to the CPRB, nor did we find a breakdown of race of those calling police and are those who are subject to calls of police, although you could see the racial breakdown for stops, warnings, and arrests. The heat map for calls of service is under repair. It's being worked on as we speak, and we did get the types of arrests wherein force was used. We showed you that here a little while ago. I just want to give Commissioner Simmons his seat, if he'd like it. You okay? Chair, I'm happy to do a couple of things. My goal would be to get us into discussion, but if the commissioners have anything else that they wanted to ask that I'm in a position to answer, I'll be happy to try. If community members wanted to ask anything, if you wanted to recognize anybody, I'm happy to try to answer any of their questions before we get into a discussion.
Thank you, Larry. First, any commissioners that wanted to ask some questions?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
So Larry,
Yes, sir.
a couple of things. First, will we have access to the raw data that you have access to?
Absolutely, Commissioner. You'll have everything that we have. Yes,
So
sir.
it'll be in the form of a spreadsheet or something that we can?
Yes, we can provide it in any format, but I think a spreadsheet would probably be the most useful to you. It's sort of multiple spreadsheets, so it might end up being 15 tabs on one file or something of that nature, but absolutely, we intend to give you all that we have.
Right. And then in terms of the, whether they were customized little algorithms or whatever algorithms are used to generate the graphs based on the, we also have access to those, like how you generated?
Yes, sir, and I would say to you that most of the graphs were provided to us. The only graphs really that were not were things like the aggregation of applicant data that was done in table form, and we just mashed it up into a graph. But a lot of the graphs were just pulled directly from city data.
So that for those, you don't have the actual raw data that went into the graph, you don't?
Correct, not necessarily. I mean, but I think the raw data exists. It must exist.
Okay.
We just may not have been given it because it was more expedient to just, provide us a compendium of data, and we used it that way.
Okay.
Yes,
thanks.
sir.
Only other thing I have, this Commissioner Johnson, a little bit more information on the Back to Blue and how they're planning on basically abolishing any accountability.
Yes, sir. If we have some time while I'm having you all work on this next exercise, I can try to pull the text from, and I know Mr. Jones has it also, of the law that's pending that relates to community police oversight, so that you understand what's being proposed. Absolutely.
This relates to what Commissioner Amos, this relates to what Commissioner Lewis talked about.
Get a little closer to the microphone.
Yeah, my name is Amos, and this relates to what Commissioner Lou has talked about on the data. And we know history is important. It is what actually sometimes makes us react and respond for good change. We don't just look at one thing on one day and say, no, this is bad. We give people time. And the community can also give authorities time. But it reaches a point when they say the data is sufficient enough to call for action. The Iowa City community has done that in several occasions. The Iowa City Police Department has done that too in several occasions. I'll talk with the Iowa City community. They have responded, and in 2013, they called for an ad hoc, just like ours here, commission to look for diversity, and for which police action was a very important thing. There was a report that was given. Probably that report was very instrumental in making some of the changes that are now being denied by the state. And so what I would want, and this is for the help of others, is to have a history of those reports, like the ad hoc committee. The report that it had is not showing up, is in here. I really looked for it last night and I couldn't get hold of it, because that could have really helped me a lot. So that's not there. Second, on telling the story about disproportionality. The study started in maybe 2005. The good studies, that is by Professor Chris Burnham of Ambrose University. And I really spent a lot of time last night looking at all his studies, and he's done a very good job. Yeah, I went there with a lot of suspicion, and he's done probably better than the others. But earlier on, before actually came to the scene, we had a study from Louisville University in 2000, maybe 5 or 6, I'm not sure of that very well, and that was a very bad one. And I think the police department did a very good thing to work with Chris. Now they are doing another good thing, working with the University of Iowa Public Policy. That was approved by the city, and I don't know when. I think they have had some time. They must have some information that can supplement what Professor Chris has given us. So we would want to see what they are doing.
Yes.
What is their funding that is new? Yeah, and then that can help us a little bit. But I want to emphasize on disproportionality. Chris, Professor, gives us a lot of history, 2005, all that. I wonder, if I was in a class, probably I would show how I want it to look like, because graphs tell us, like he said, a lot of history where changes have happened. And I think the conclusion that you have alluded to earlier has been that there's no increase in disproportionality. I could see that a little bit, but that does not mean the problem is out. Yeah. What we don't know is whether we have reached a maturity where the city actions and changes are going to make any difference yet. Is it now just based on the behavior of the community, the people who are being caught? Could we reach a maturity, or there's still room for improvement? And that's what we are going to worry much about. Yeah, so I really need that. It's going to help other people looking at our report. Otherwise, if we look at it in one section, cross-section at one time, I think the community will say, hey, what's that commission doing? And me, personally, I don't like stuff like that. Yeah. So it's going to be hard on you. I don't know who's going to do this, but we really, and it is not only our commission here requiring that. I looked at other ad hoc police commissions in other cities, in Louisville, I think Virginia too, I looked at that too. They make an attempt to tell you the story where we are coming from. It is good for the community. It actually sometimes shows how good the police department is helping and working towards change, so that our conclusions are not biased in the sense that this is bad. So that history, I think I'll need. Thank you. For now, I'll give other commissioners opportunity.
Just so I'm sure, I heard you talk about the work of the ad hoc committee in around 2020 or so, I believe, that was looking at proposed reforms to policing in the wake of the protests that took place in the summer?
No. This is very recent. This is earlier on. The ad hoc commission came in 2013, 14. Yeah. It was
further back.
Far back.
Further back, okay.
Yeah, and it was a response from the community, just like the community responded during the Floyd case. It was just like this one here. Okay. And I wanted to see what they did in that commission, what conclusions they had. Yeah. Okay. But the community was really up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that, and then a longer range of information from Professor Barnum, as well as perhaps some new information from the new research partners at the University of Iowa
Yes.
related to disproportionate stops.
Yes, because when you look at the history, you find that earlier on, before that 2013 commission, the disproportionality was terrible. It was almost 5 times, 4 times. We've reached a point where now it is almost 2 times. And so I want that history. That's why the community really responded in 2013. And the city did a good thing to sit down, assemble an ad hoc committee like ours.
Thank you very much, sir. I've made a note of it. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Commissioner.
So just to build off on what Amos has just said, that if we're going to understand the changes over time and what the current problem is, we're going to have to get into the weeds with respect to the disproportionality. And that's why we need the raw data. So if there's 3 times the expected number of stops, what exactly are those stops for? Because unless we know exactly what those stops are for, we're not going to be able to know what additional training might be called for or whether training is ever going to resolve it. So I think it's important to be able to get as much of the ground truth, quote, that we can from the individualized data, and then we can all have a chance to look at that.
Absolutely.
Larry, question, when you were doing your research, were you able to run into any other organizations in the area that are also looking into this stuff, or?
I think my answer to that is incomplete, Chair. I mean, I think I was really just trying to see how much information could be collected across the sources that we identified. And so it's my neglect that we didn't tap into other non-governmental organizations collecting data like the NAACP. We would if we had more time.
And then could you share with us what was your experience in collecting this data, difficulties or challenges, or the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, Police Chief Liston has been very responsive to all of our requests. I think there are interesting limitations, not through any malfeasance of his necessarily, but just interesting limitations on how recent some of the data is and how thorough some of the data is on your specific charge. Meaning the fact that we can't identify arrests or offenses by someone who identifies as Hispanic or Latino in the FBI statistics and can't go beyond 6 or 7 years ago is very odd. I don't know what to make of that. But I think that the amount of information to be had about the interactions between police and civilians is pretty vast. I'm sort of pleasantly surprised in that respect, because a lot of times it would only be, you might expect it only to be something that's kind of public record, like a police report, an arrest and a police report or charges filed. By the way, I didn't say this, but I know that part of the story around criminal justice is what happens after someone is charged. And that's an extremely important part of the process, meaning how are they charged, how are they defended, and well beyond what we have time to research. But there's a lot to be said for what happens to a particular defendant, whether white, black, Hispanic, Asian, when they are put on trial or, looking at a plea bargain or something like that. And that's a whole other batch of information. I also think that the way that we can review matters brought before the Community Police Review Board is not as easy. And this is no reflection on our friend from the CPRB, but just the way that the database is organized is not as easily searched, is the best way I can say it. And I think that, her point about the notes taken is something that I think would be very helpful to have someone go through in detail. All of those, what I'd call qualitative data around how this independent body reviewed allegations of misconduct. I think that's a really important thing to look at, because the fact that only 8 of the complaints made it to the point where the CPRB and the chief diverge is not the whole story by any stretch. If anything, it might be misleading, but in the absence of being able to go through all of that qualitative data, it's hard for me to, give you much more information. And the thing that I think is most, not most, but interesting to think about is what is it that is or isn't leading someone to go through with a complaint. And I don't mean to suggest that there's way more misbehavior than the number of complaints, but it certainly is a relatively small number, I think. And so it would be interesting to, maybe in the truth-telling phase or in some other way, try to understand why someone didn't pursue that. And that's not a data set that we know of existing. It would have to be collected, why someone did or didn't pursue a complaint. There's our, there's our expert.
Until sometime within the last 2 years, this was a change that I helped pursue. If you did not have access to a printer and postage and you wanted to file a complaint, you had to walk into the police department to get an application and fill it out. So I think that was an obvious barrier for power dynamic reasons. When somebody's been harmed, they don't want to walk into the space of the people that have harmed them. They are now available online, but there also hasn't been a big effort to make that known. You can now file a complaint online. You can now participate in a community police review board meeting through Zoom. But they're already talking about taking Zoom accessibility away because of a lack of public participation. But there's been no press release. There's been no, hey, you can do this now. So people don't know about it.
I want to thank you, Mandy, for being here as a representation of the Community Police Review Board. Thank you.
Other questions before we continue?
Commissioner Amos again, on the facts, the problem that you presented to us, where we have the answers in there. We are worried about, I can tell you about the sources. One of the sources that is also missing here is opinion surveys.
Opinion surveys.
Yeah, we want to get the pulse of the community. The Iowa City Police Department did their own opinion survey in 2016, and they had 5 questions. In those 5 questions, they did not ask anything about racial relations or what they think the community think about them dealing with the differences and the diversity in the community. They were just asking about how well do we do, how good is our job, and there were 5 questions, and later there were comments later that people said. In the comments section, which are very many, is where you find individuals now making an attempt to fill that gap by putting their own comments about those kind of problems the community is having. So that was a bad job by the police department, but I think it was maybe their first attempt to do a survey because they are not usually doing that. They usually hire other people. And that is in the PDF, it's 2016 survey, Iowa City Police Department. We can look at. It's something that I would probably, I don't want to get recommendations now, consensus, but something that we will look into how often we can do those opinion surveys. Also, related to opinion surveys, the Johnson County did a health survey last year, 2 years ago, in which they were seeking opinion on safety. They consider safety as a very important aspect of health of the community, probably mental health. If they think the community is worried about some things, they don't have the freedom to move. They are afraid of going somewhere because of what they think, or of something triggering a trauma of what they have. That, even though they might be healthy physically, is really a big deal. And we don't get experts. In our commission, we were not given, or we would have benefited from the experts of police behavior on mental health, how it affects community, their jobs, their workplaces, their freedom of movement to do other things. We don't have data on that. So much of this data the community absorbs in their bodies. All we see here are reports of stops and other things, and the story probably ends there. But in my opinion, I think in the future, I will recommend we have opinions on the impact of that thing on people's health and other things. Yeah. So that's why I need opinion surveys. The one on Johnson County is available. You can look at it, and I think I sent it to your associate. Maybe I think you remember that. Yeah. And it's not that bad, but we have concerns from the minorities. Yeah.
No, it's valid. It's valid. I appreciate you mentioning that, and we'll certainly try to include it in the report to the council.
This is Commissioner Wangui. I am going to tag my contribution to what Amos is talking about.
So sorry. Just asking for a clarification on the state law. I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Yeah, I'm saying I'll piggyback on what Amos has shared. Thank you, Larry, for bringing in, making John Deng's death back in the summer of '09 part of this fact finding, because it ties to what a lot of what Commissioner Amos has talked about. It has made me curious. For example, John Deng's case, as far as me as a community member, and being a community member, an African immigrant, and John Deng was a refugee who sought refuge and asylum in Iowa City from what has been going on in Sudan, South Sudan, for the longest time, but then ends up being shot on the street. The case took, you've got the facts, and when I go back in, the exact time, but it took about a month. Back then, it wasn't the way it was today. For example, how the community people were able to agitate for George Floyd. That didn't happen, and I'm not saying that what we have, what was investigated, is not what was, but the fact that it keeps coming back and now it's part of this fact-finding is that there are some people who are still not satisfied by the outcome. So where I'm getting to with this is whether you still have time, and if you don't, whether to still be able to look at, Amos talked about minority. And back in 2020, I don't know whether you'll be able to still make that part of your fact finding. April 2020, we had, the Kenyan community had brought an agenda to be heard by the TRC and to get help on looking into a Kenyan who was found dead at 6 a.m. In April of 2021. Where I'm going at with this is ever fact-finding on whether the numbers, whether the same attention and the same care, investigation of deaths of people, whether those two cases I'm mentioning, this particular one, I think his name is, I know the last name is Gila, the one in April in 2021, whether Gila, Deng, and if we were having somebody called Smith, the treatment of how the cases were concluded would have been the same. So, and whether it's still within And I'm still thinking it's still within the scope of this fact finding, even if you don't get to that just bringing out whether, in my own opinion, and also the research and experiences, anecdotal evidence, and my own reading. It isn't, again, the numbers are disproportionate, how these deaths are treated. But it would be good to see what would come out of that.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of, Commissioner, that could have maybe efficiently, I wholeheartedly agree with you about the relevance of the case to your work. The only thing I was thinking about in terms of an efficient way that we might be able to look into it is perhaps, so for instance, in Mr. Deng's case, the Iowa Attorney General conducted the investigation. I might be able to identify the times in which the Attorney General has investigated either ICPD, Johnson County, or University of Iowa, and what came of those cases over a certain period of time. The problem becomes if it doesn't get there and there is no documentary record, then it's hard for me to, other than doing interviews, it's hard for me to know exactly what the data shows. So I can attempt to search that way, which might yield some fruit. But I've made note of your case, and we'll add it to the file.
There might be a situation, too, where certain kind of cases have to be done at that level. So.
I think that any time, I could be mistaken about this, I don't know if Councilmember Burgess knows, but any time, at least in my state, I think any time that a weapon is discharged or any sort of, death in custody, I would think that a case like that would almost always get investigated by a body external to whichever law enforcement agency conducted it. Could be a DOJ, I guess, but it usually would be a state attorney general.
And we've also had cases in which the city hired an independent investigator. So the one that comes to mind was the incident in which a number of protesters were tear gassed and pepper sprayed on June 3rd, 2020. And we just hired an outside firm to do that. I do not know what the threshold normally is for triggering who would do a different investigation.
So Larry, if I can follow up on that. Good.
Go ahead, Lou.
Oh, go ahead. So Larry, I was just going to say that I don't know if this would help, but it seems to me that maybe to address some of this, you could look at, if this is easily accessible, unsolved suspicious deaths by race. Because that would give potentially an index of who's putting resources where. But I don't know if that...
I could certainly ask for that information. I would think that something like that might be available, but it might have to be compiled as opposed to existing as such. Go ahead.
Just to the previous question, if the chief of police is involved in the situation that the complaint is about, then it falls to a second person, and I think that second person is the city manager, but I could be wrong. And then if the city manager is also a part of the situation, then that's when it's supposed to go to an independent third party. And in this situation, because they had activated this entire response that involved multiple forces, the chief and the city manager were both involved in the incident.
Thank you.
Commissioner Amos, this is a question on budgets, police funding. And in the last meeting, I was worried about...
Are you asking for budgets to who?
Police budgets.
Police budgets,
okay.
Law enforcement budgets, yeah. When we look at the graph, and I think you will remember it is going up, and we have explanations for that. Commissioner Chad helped me with that a little bit on the issues of inflation, insurance, and other things, which are always true for every department. And in relation to that, we also see that there's not much increase in the law enforcement personnel. But somebody was asking that how comes when we are looking at the law enforcement personnel, we bring issues of disproportionality in terms of the size of the city comparable to Iowa and other factors. I think the size of the city is what matters very much, I see in your reports. One thing that they seem to be neglecting is crime rates. Police departments don't just do things for the sake of it. They respond to crime rates. So the cities could be the same size, but if the crime rates due to other reasons, maybe unemployment, social conditions in those communities are very bad, it's not going to be the same. Yet they are of the same population. The Iowa City Department has data on crime rates. That's their number one data that actually is very important for them. And they can track that over years. And they never use that to compare and correlate police enforcement level or personnel with the crime rates. We know they do that. In the other previous meeting, I talked about the establishment of the satellite police station in the Southern District there. It was a response to the spike in crime rate in that area. So we know they do that. Even their documents talked about it. On that day, I was very much afraid to talk about it because it was touching on police strategy and other things. I thought it was a sacred issue. But last night, when I didn't sleep, I found there's a public document that explains why that happened. So I can talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it gave me evidence that they respond to where crimes are. So if we in the community are not that bad, we don't need to have very many. Somebody was worried, maybe one of the commissioners, why am I worried about the budgets and other things? And I was saying, can we bend the curve? It's okay. It's an issue of efficiency. Maybe the people are really getting good. The community is a very good community to live in. Everybody likes one another. They don't want to hurt one another. There's not much crime. Yeah. So we can divert some of those resources to issues of mental health. Then the Sudanese who was killed was suffering from mental health.
Right.
He was a guy who was homeless.
Right.
He could have been helped through other sources. So that is where the Commission's worry is, on reallocation of resources, efficient use of public resources. Yeah. It does not mean that we are against
Right.
other things. Yeah.
Well, I think I just want to flag, as someone who cares very deeply about, the ultimate result of your work, you can certainly make a recommendation informed by data and by firsthand testimony about what you think the police department, how you think the police department should be staffed or budgeted. I mean, it may seem like a level of detail that's meant for people like Councilmember Burgess, but you're here to try to remedy perceptions or realities of racial mistreatment, racial inequity. And if you believe that even though the comparison of expenditure and the comparison of department numbers is still too high, you can say that. There's nothing outside, in my opinion at least, professionally, there's nothing outside of your purview as a commissioner that would keep you from being able to say that. You could even draw a conclusion that despite how the department compares in size to other departments, that there are too many officers. You could make that determination. But I would encourage you to allow truth-telling and maybe some conversation directly with the department to be incorporated into that, rather than doing that just with the data that we've been able to collect for you.
Could I build on that for a second? So with that graph that you have there, would it be difficult to throw in another comparison that's just based on crime rates?
In other words, cities with similar rates of crime and their
Right.
staffing? We can try.
Okay. I mean, I think that would help address the question. And I think it's important because there's a way in which, I don't know if it's a perfect analogy, but it's kind of like workload. And so if there's a lower workload, then you wouldn't necessarily have to, so.
I have a quick question, maybe you might be able to answer. Because one reason I believe that like the number of police officers is based on a per capita, because it's, think about the tax dollars and the amount of money to pay for the salaries and that kind of stuff, or how is that?
No, to my understanding, and Chief Liston would be the one who could answer that best, but to my understanding, it's really just based on what the department requests and how the city manager responds to that, and then how the council responds to that. But I've never had any kind of, formula or recommendation other than these kinds of statistics. And I do think in the 2020 preliminary plan to restructure the police department, there were some of those comparisons of crime rate and this type of data, near each other. Not in graph form, but in a table.
But there's looking at the data, and then the police chief would decide like how many staff that he felt needed to deal with it, that kind of thing?
I think
Or is
so,
that-
yeah. And he may be using formulas. It's just from where we're sitting in terms of the budgeting process, we're not presented with that information.
Commissioner, I mentioned same issue of budgets. We may need to also see the urge in which the Iowa City Police Department is. In terms of the urge, in terms of the proposals, budgetary proposals, in terms of requirements for more money.
You said the urge? Is that what
Yes,
you said?
the urge for the demand for. Let's
what is
use
the
the
impetus?
economic,
What
the
is the
demand
impetus for that?
for more resources. And over time, we want to look at, because it could be that it is the council, the city council, that is saving us. We don't know. How many times have they made proposals? 10% increase, 20% in every budgetary cycle. Suppose we had a council that was accepting everything. What would have been happening? Yeah. We want to see how much resistant, how wise our city council is in terms discretionary, in terms of making sure that everything's are done measurable. So I want to see that gap in which, and it could be that there isn't that big gap in terms of their demands for additional resources, equipment, and other things that maybe sometimes the city feels is not necessary. Things that the community feels, and I'm not talking about this because I'm just worried about the money thing academically. These are things that usually when you take the opinion of the people in the community, they talk about. They are worried about them. Sometimes they don't have a way to translate those worries into other things, into other policy issues. So I want to see different budgetary proposals. Which ones over a year, maybe 10-year period, 20 period, something like that. Then we see how wise, how good our city commission is in terms of protecting our resources for our safety.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding the data you're looking for, because we have data about what the police budgets are. Are you talking about what they initially requested and how that compared to what was approved?
Yes.
Okay.
Tying in with what Commissioner Amos and Commissioner Merritt have just said about budgeting and public safety funding, if possible, before you wind off, because anyway, you're winding up. I wonder whether it would be possible to fact find around the statistics on the use of public safety, or calling public safety along cultural racial lines, because everybody pays taxes and they fund public safety, but on being served and calling. And where I'm coming from is from research and other information, and also my own experiences and anecdotal, those of others that I know. And this one, I'll go back to my being black, so I'm really talking about black people, but also other BIPOC people. They will hesitate to call and even for me personally, public safety is not my first go-to or my first thought to go to. And this is coming from, earlier on, Amos had mentioned mental health. And also with my experience as the person right now who is coordinating in Eastern Iowa, NISA African Family Services, an organization whose mission is to end violence in our African communities, including in Iowa City, and mainly domestic violence. And the statistics are higher, and this is global, that mostly it's women and girls who identify as women and girls who really domestic violence and sexual assault happens to. The people I serve who are African, the public safety, the police are not the first people they're going to want to call.
Right.
Or if I have a family member who they have, an example, a psychotic breakdown, the family, especially if the person happens to be male, the first person they're going to think of is not the police, because you brought up information at Robert Lee of a situation where public safety comes in and the situation even gets escalated. So there's always that fear that, okay, my husband is beating me, or my boyfriend or whomever, or my child. And from when children are 3 years old, they are taught that public safety, it's really safety. So call them. But this is not the case for us.
The only point I want to make is we heard, I feel as if I've heard you ask for this piece of data, and I want you to know we looked to see whether we could identify calls for service by race, meaning can we identify the race of someone who called for police? And we cannot. But it could feed into a public opinion survey in which you ask people, have you called? Or what was the outcome when you called? Would you call in the future? And so forth. I don't think that there is data collected. In other words, when someone is calling 911 for police support or the non-emergency line, I don't think they collect the information on their race. But if you survey the community, you might be able to get that information. I just didn't want you to think we were ignoring that data, because I think it's important data, but I don't think it's being collected at this moment.
Actually, really, I was saying not even, I just wanted to have this on record just so that it doesn't get lost.
Absolutely.
Even if it doesn't happen right now, that somewhere down the line, so that we can also, in our community, so that we can also be able to deal with, eventually with people, they're paying taxes, then they're afraid that if they call for help, it might result in a death or more escalation of the very situation they were trying to resolve and be safe from.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And please, I'm sure you know this, we know each other, but please know I'm in no way, what's the word? Discounting the significance of knowing what it is that you want to know. I just want to make sure that I'm transparent in saying we tried, to look for that, and I'd like you to be able to get that information, but it won't come from data that's already been collected from what I can see.
If there's no other commissioner comments, I'm going to open up to the public. If anyone would like to step up to the microphone, if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're going to move on to discussion with Dr. Schooler. It looks like no one has any questions.
There's someone being held in the back whose opinion I'd really like to know. They're wearing a hat. I suspect that what they have to say would be very eloquent.
Vivek Maharaj, I just wanted to note that some of the data that you're looking for may be at the county medical examiner's office, especially when you were talking about the deaths that were unsolved and by minorities. I think that probably would be at the medical examiner's office. So I just wanted to add that as one of your sources. And I messaged Larry, but I also wanted to tell you all that the Johnson County Medical Examiner's Office serves the Johnson County. So that's where that data would come from. But just wanted to note that.
Thank you. We can move on to discussion now.
Yes. It looked like I have a teacher's pet who's already working on her homework assignment that's on the screen. Okay.
Maybe.
Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. It's a little bit more writing, but the goal of this is to look through the data that's in front of you and use the notepads to indicate, I conclude X based on the data that I have received. Now, again, this is very preliminary. You haven't heard truth, you haven't heard testimony. You don't have all of the data that there is to be had. But what I'm going to challenge you to do is at least think through what the data is telling you thus far, and perhaps collectively what you agree the data suggests, and then that can inform some of what you seek to understand when people come and testify at truth-telling events or when you seek out others to testify in other settings. So one conclusion per sticky, and we're going to use the front here to assemble those. I'm going to step away for just a minute, but the goal is to get some of your thoughts down on paper, and then we will discuss.
Thank you for that break.
Very welcome. Even facilitators need one from time to time. I just want to underscore that's the role that I'm going to play here in the last little time we have left, is not to present any more information, to really shift the conversation to you all, to talk as a group about what the data are telling you, and what, if any, conclusions do you feel comfortable drawing at this moment. But I know you all know this. I'm just going to say it again. I'm not here to draw those conclusions for you. I'm not trying to shirk responsibility, but it's my role to help you all do your work more easily, not to do it. And so I look forward to facilitating this discussion and seeing where we go. So the stickies were, I think, being utilized. So I'm going to...
Larry, before you continue,
Yes.
I just want to thank you for presenting all the findings in a very painless way. Thank you. Even if they're painful.
Good job. Yeah.
Wait, this should be.
I like the use of the hereby. I feel fancy.
I want to throw a tantrum. I went back, I found the sweet stuff is finished. It's right in the book.
There you
And then
go.
I just discovered, oh, it's sparkling water. Right now, I would have wanted a Coca-Cola.
So in facilitator school, they teach us about a gallery walk, which is where the participants go and look at each other's comments. I'm going to be a little more efficient, since it would be like all of us kind of like leaning like this over it and do some reading. But just so you know, I like a good gallery walk. You're not getting the very best here, but I'll do the best I can. All right, I'm going to start over here. I conclude more sophisticated and detailed statistical analyses need to be conducted to understand what is behind the disparities. I conclude that Kim Reynolds needs to retire. Since the name is common, I'm just assuming for the record you mean the governor of the state of Iowa. I conclude, I'm just glad Vivek Marias Laura Burgess' name weren't on here. That would have been disastrous. I conclude we need to understand what the distinction between discretionary and non-discretionary means to rank and file officers. Police need oversight, not less. Transparency is key. In my conclusion on the info given, that we need more funding for mental health and other ways of bringing out the best in our city, I do not believe that less policies to oversee our officers is the right way. There needs to be racial equity for Black and Africans while in relation to public safety and the court system, including traffic stops, arrests, de-escalation, use of force, etc. Use of violence in stops and arrests is disproportionate towards minorities. Expert opinion on the impacts of, I'm so sorry, my friend, on the impacts of,
On the impacts on health, work, and liberties.
on the impacts of health
On.
Yes. Health, work, and liberties. Relation to, I see. I missed one, okay. I conclude that attempts to recruit a more diverse and inclusive police force are inadequate. I conclude there are significant racial disparities in stops and arrests that need to be understood and addressed. Underrepresentation of sworn officers who are Black or minority. Diversity training is not including other cultural aspects. Evidence of cultural training pertaining to immigrants is not clear or missing. Does the race of officers matter? No good evidence. Locations of stops in predominantly minority residential areas. Spikes in crime are not there anymore, yet stops are high in neighborhoods, including the Broadway area. I conclude the current Iowa City PD is trying to do the right thing. Lots of missing data related to police calls and race. Who initiated the call by race? What was the response? What is the race of the person being called on? What is the purpose of the call? Where is the incidence or the call? I hereby conclude, not just I conclude, but I hereby conclude that discovered data thus far indicates that in the last 2 decades, Iowa City has made attempts to correct any bias. These attempts appear positive on paper. However, anecdotal data shows many holes, data, and viewpoints missing from the picture. We need much more community-based generated data and more history to show how Iowa City got here. We are missing a lot, even though this is a lot of info. While trends are not up, disproportionate police stops and contacts still exist. It is not at all clear without crime data being related to the city size whether our safety force resources are allocated efficiently. Crime rates decreased significantly according to the data. Comparing stops and arrests with Iowa City's resident population, how many of them were from here? Data does reveal that a dialogue is needed between ICPD and the community and discuss how to better protect the community without endangering those who serve and residents. asking Kearns and West about what data fact-finding questions are we not asking but should be based on your experience in this field. Did I leave anybody out? I normally don't do this, but that deserves applause. That was really impressive. You don't have to applaud. I'm just saying it deserves applause. But pat yourselves on the back. You did wonderful work there, all of you. What did you hear?
Yes. There's some flaws in our system that we need to really address before it gets worse. And it just...
I think it was, and I'm not trying to call you out, but I think
I'm all about it.
you were focused on oversight. What is it that you most want to see overseen? I mean, in other words, we don't know what's going to come of this state law that might do away with the Civilian Oversight Board, but regardless of what the vehicle is, what oversight do you want to see provided?
It goes back to me with mental health awareness. I feel like, I believe there's other cities right now that have groups that come out either with the police officers or something else along those lines. I feel like that's extremely helpful because a lot of these situations can totally be de-escalated without the anxiety of dealing with an officer. A lot of these situations can be misunderstandings or just things in general that if you would approach it in a different light, you wouldn't have as many arrests. You would have somebody who's actually educated in de-escalating situations specifically, rather than just, okay, well, you did this and I'm just gonna take you in. I feel like the less oversight we have is the exact wrong direction. Oversight shouldn't be a threat. Transparency shouldn't be a threat. If it is, that says a lot about whatever system that we have that's going on. And for us to focus a little bit more on support for our police, but support in a way that helps our community, I think that would be the most ideal.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say that I'm sure if you were to ask police chief here or wherever, and if you ask about the calls that are made, I mean, so many of the 911 calls, the police are the last ones that are really should be the one to go to it, but there are no resources available to send someone or whatever else. Or it'd be nice if they had, a group that could, accompany if it was sounding like, oh, this is a mental health issue, or something like that. I mean, I know that there have been discussions of the police having certain training, or if they already have it from other jobs, being able to utilize it, in the position here, having some additional, some mental health kind of training, so they can recognize situations. But again, it goes down to, money for the training, that kind of stuff. And, but it needs to happen. It does.
Money for the training, if we keep watching every year, they get more and more money. It sounds like they got it. And if they don't, a proportion of that can go in that direction. I don't see a reason why not, and especially if it makes their job safer and easier. If you have somebody that can just completely de-escalate a situation without them even getting involved, they're the backup. They should be the last line of defense, not the very first in majority of these situations. So, yeah, if we can get somebody else that is maybe an officer that is completely trained only in trying to nullify whatever problem that's out there before anybody needs to be arrested. The goal is to bring down that arrest rate more than anything else. Just try to chip it away.
Just for whoever might be taking notes, so we do have a co-response currently where we have a trained mental health professional from Community Crisis Services who can go with our officers, but this idea that they be that those mental health professionals be the first line of response is being implemented in our community. It's very, very new, and we're having problems at the dispatch level, actually getting the dispatchers to send those calls to the crisis counselors rather than to other kinds of responders. But this is something the council's going to be talking about over the next few months as well. So just want to make sure this information, now I'm looking at city staff, that we can circle back and get all the information back to you all so that you have that as you're looking at recommendations.
Laura, can you tell us why dispatch is having issues?
I think it's a cultural thing. So I serve on the board for the Joint Emergency Communications Center that is the countywide dispatch for all the agencies. And I think it's just a very different mindset to have someone who's calling, who's in crisis, to hand them off to a counselor who, 97+% of the time that resolves on the telephone. They don't have to send someone out, but a dispatcher is like, I will get you a person to address the situation immediately. So I just think, the training is happening, the training has happened, but there's just more that needs to go on.
How's the funding for that, if you don't mind?
Well, I have asked for us to fund a crisis counselor to be in the dispatch center. So talk to my colleagues about that if you want that to happen. Yes, and that would be countywide. So it would be
Councillor, can I add help? And because these are the ones that are going to go there immediately. The others might die in the papers, but I know if you hear it. On the dispatches and the people who receive these calls, I think we need diversity.
Yes.
And when I talk of diversity, you touched about it. It's not just race.
right.
Cultural diversity. Yes, yeah. So there could be issues that sometimes can be worked out, like Commissioner Cliff says, within the community. Maybe somebody has wisdom in the community. Some societies, communities have that sense of there are people you can talk to first in the community about these disputes before you go to the other person. So that element requires some level of education.
Yes.
Yeah, and because in our communities here, to tell you the truth, I look at a lot of data, and just among we the blacks, 60% of the blacks are those who, in Iowa City right now, in Johnson County,
Okay.
are those who are born here, either recently or over generations. 60% of the blacks. The rest, 40%, are immigrants, black from Africa. 39.6 to be accurate, to tell you the truth. So the culture of Iowa City is changing.
Yes.
And I know I might be touching on an area that other people are not very comfortable with, but we will have to live with this here because it's a good place, and those cultures are here, different cultures are in here. We just have to learn, and the organizations or agencies will have to adapt very quickly. Yeah. And they are willing to learn. We always learn. The other people from other cultures. When we come here, we agree to learn and adapt. Yeah. We are not that resistant. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about your department. How many people are in your department, if you don't mind me asking? Yes. If you could come up on the mic, it'd be great. Thank you.
Our mobile crisis team probably has about 30 folks that are in our main responder team, and then there are 4 co-responders with different jurisdictions. Yeah. And I'm happy to answer any other.
Are we able to, with the proper funding and everything, do you feel like you guys have enough? Or do you feel like you need, for the amount of people we have here in the city and the diversity that we have, do you have the proper staff to take care of everybody?
Yeah, we need more sustainable funding to allow us to provide benefited positions to really well-trained crisis counselors, retain that institutional knowledge, increase quality of service, make it a job people want to stay in for a long time. I think also, we are meeting our call volume right now, but as Laura was sharing, there are kind of challenges at the dispatch level. If we were responding to every call for service that had a mental health component, we would need many, many more counselors, and we would need a lot more money to pay them equitably and to retain them to do the job well.
Yeah. Do you think it would be helpful to have this as to have the same type of, I'm military, so when I come from military, I'm thinking, all right, well, when it comes down to the Marines, everybody's a rifleman. You get me? When it comes down to your department, would it be helpful for you guys to go to the same type of training as the police officers do, or do you?
So our co-responders go through different kind of scene safety training. They have radio training, they have vests. Our crisis counselors go through a different kind of training. It also involves situational awareness and scene safety. I would say, you know, we could probably be better educated in scene safety in order to kind of reach the skill level that we would be able to respond to things like a welfare check. I would say it could also go the other direction. You know, we have things to learn from each other. But what I wouldn't want is for us to replicate the service that police are providing. We have a whole nother set of skills and another way of approaching things that doesn't involve scene clearing, but involves really taking our time with people, letting them narrativize their own crisis, and spending as much time as we need with them to meet their needs.
I definitely understand that. The only reason why I brought that up was I feel like when you guys are more comfortable to go into any situation, because you are more focused on negotiating things, think of it like a hostage negotiator.
Yeah,
They have the police that are all there, but
Yeah.
the hostage negotiator goes in to
Yeah.
make sure that they de-escalate the situation and turn it into something better
Yep.
without a fight.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking maybe if you guys had if you were going to the same training or along the same lines as the same training as the officers, then that gives you a different perspective on what they're looking at, what you might be dealing with, and in general, just make it less likely to have them involved.
Yeah,
You get me?
absolutely. I do. And I would love for our mobile crisis team to have additional training to respond to things like public disturbance or trespassing calls or welfare checks where, you know, social workers are already going into those environments, you know, every day, separate from the dispatch system, and interacting with people, and very, very rarely incurring harm to themselves, because most people in mental health crisis are not going to perpetrate harm. But I know the public has concerns about kind of unarmed people entering those spaces, and so, you know, to me, that training would kind of prepare us to message exactly about what we're doing and how consistently we're going to do it, and that we're really well prepared to do it, because I think, you know, in my view, in my vision, the kinds of calls we could respond to would be broadened, and would, you know, things could fall to us that were falling to PD.
The goal is to make it more attractive. The more attractive to bring more people in that want to join in, the less likely we have to go to drastic measures, if you will. That's all.
And I will also share that our counseling team, not necessarily the corresponders often, but also our own counseling team has been called in often by law enforcement to help de-escalate, because we had a skill set and we had rapport with a person that wasn't available to them in that moment, or we had a different approach, and have had successful kind of interactions where I believe there was a reduction in the harm that may have occurred to any number of people on scene if our crisis counselors hadn't come and provided what we do, which is very different. So that's already happening, is my point, that sometimes
On a rough estimate, what would you say, rough estimate, of course, in a scale of 1 to 100, your percentage of de-escalating situations have been?
Yeah, so like how often are we successful in kind of, well, maybe you can share more, like.
What I mean by that is rather than a situation go to the extreme, what's
Yeah.
the likelihood you guys are to kind of get somebody to just go
Stabilize.
easy and
Yeah,
or just walk away?
So
you know?
it's hard to predict what the outcome of a situation would have been, but I can tell you that our diversion rate from both jail and hospitalization is in the 90s consistently, mid-90s. The remainder of those calls are someone deciding voluntarily to seek a higher level of care. So kind of meeting with counselors and determining, in order to stay safe, I need to go somewhere else. We have had no crisis call ever result in an arrest coming through our channels. Like, there's some times when we are not no longer kind of dictating what happens on scene, but no crisis call that we've ever had has resulted in an arrest of that individual. And we have very, very, very few calls where we involuntarily call for backup of some kind from another first responder service. So mobile crisis works very well. I've worked a little across the continuum of care. People like it. People kind of, we see its efficacy in kind of helping people stabilize and be able to stay safe for now in the moment. I'm in this from a career in therapy because I can see the power of this intervention relative to other interventions in the continuum of care. So,
Do you find that it might be possibly helpful if there's an officer and then there's, instead of like their partner, there's you or one of your...
Yep. So there's different kind of versions of that. There's the version where the co-responder goes, who is embedded in the police department and sort of has kind of partner-like rapport with the officers. They work together frequently. Again, they have kind of additional safety things. And then there's a version where they call for us to come attend to the scene. Very often, and ideally for us, like if the scene is deemed safe, they can hand it off to us and no longer be present on scene at all. And I would,
where I'm getting to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal in any case where it's possible for it to kind of completely kind of dissolve the law enforcement component. Like we would love to do that, and that happens a lot actually.
What I was thinking is, if you're with them, and instead of the officer getting out and handling it first, one of you guys go and handle it, and then you just let the officer know if they are even needed, really.
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
situation.
absolutely. And often they can see that they're not needed, in fact. Yeah. And, there are other communities I will share around the country that have mobile crisis responders answering these higher acuity calls for service unarmed and doing really wonderful work, and it's working for those communities.
Good to go. Thank you.
And anyone else that has questions anywhere along the way?
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to follow up
Yeah.
something that Laura had mentioned, that can you give me a sense, like, what is the decision tree like for the dispatcher?
Yeah.
So a call comes in, what did they have to do to decide how to sort
Yeah.
who's going where?
So our dispatcher right now is not the 911 dispatcher. That's a future goal where the calls would be transferred to us directly off 911. So we have a separate dispatch line. The person on that dispatch line is asking safety questions about animals in the house, weapons in the house, and then questions about that person's ideation around suicide risk or harm towards other people. And they have sort of empirically validated questions that they ask. There's Columbia screening, all kinds of ways that they get at asking those questions. I would say the main safety, one of the biggest kind of safety protocols we have there is that people are self-referring. So we're right now in our non-co-responder program, we're a totally voluntary service. So, if someone tells us, please go away from us now, we will do that. So that provides a lot of safety in its own right. So if someone had plan, means, time frame, and intent to harm themselves or someone else, the dispatcher would determine, and weren't willing to work on safety, they weren't going to try to work on safety, or they'd already done something to harm themselves, like ingested with an intent to die, the dispatcher would determine that that wasn't a safe mobile crisis call, and would probably call for paramedics
Okay.
in that case. Yeah.
Commissioner Amos here, and on the same subject, just if at all that doesn't exist, and smarter data systems, because you just have learned how we run into problems because we don't have data.
Yeah.
We can't explain a lot of things. So we don't want to hear next time that, we are not collecting data on race.
Yeah.
We are not collecting data on this and this and this.
Yeah.
So I think it's good you are here. You are hearing this very well.
Yeah. And
Okay.
we are collecting data on race, on gender expression, on sexuality, and on disability status, and are finding that folks are all of those groups are disproportionately represented in our call volume and
Okay.
our.
And work hard to make those be published for the community.
Yeah.
Yes. So, see, we didn't get it here yet. It's an impact study thing that really helps us a lot. So,
Yeah.
Good.
I know I wasn't here in this capacity, but questions were asked, so I'm really glad and happy to come speak to any of you about our work and answer questions, and also hear your input into our work and how we can better serve you all. So thank you.
Appreciate
Before
it.
you
Thank
leave, I'm curious whether your language line, whether you go beyond, since your services are 24/7.
Yeah.
Whether the language line is also on after 5 or
Yeah.
whatever time. Yeah.
Language line is available 24/7. We have languages and we have voice to text, so we can work with folks who are in the deaf community as well. We also have kind of contracted folks where if there's a scheduled dispatch, we can provide a scheduled Spanish dispatch to someone live in person, not using the language line. Yeah.
Yeah, good to hear, because some of the stats Dr. Schooler was presenting with the police, some of it escalates because of language barriers and cultural
Yeah,
barriers.
absolutely.
Yeah, and
yeah.
lack of information
Yeah.
on how to interact with
Yeah.
sadly, the responsibility in some of the minority cases seems to be on the person that's being interacted with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
And a dream in the future would be able to provide live crisis care in multiple languages around the clock. That
Yeah,
are most commonly spoken languages.
especially that reflects also proportionally to the how Iowa City right now
Yeah.
looks like.
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially Swahili, French, Arabic,
Yeah.
and also users of Spanish that has also increased.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be a dream, a vision for the future for us as well. Thank you.
I'm a believer of get to the source, and I feel like that they are one of the best bets to get to the source and kind of solve a lot of our issues all rolled up in one. That's what I personally believe, so.
Even sounds like they should just do a whole presentation to the TRC. Yeah. Thank you for what you've done and answering our questions. Thank you.
If you'd like
Other
to
community
speak,
member, come on. Yeah.
if you'd like to come to the and say your name in the mic.
I'm a recent resident here, Cynthia Dietz. I spent 10 and a half years in Winnipeg, and actually I emailed Murray Sinclair, the head of the Canadian TRC at one point, who is a retired lawyer. But I want to tell you the experience I had in Winnipeg, which addresses what can you do to help before you call police. What happened there is they had something called Meet Me at the Bell Tower. This was held every Friday at a neighborhood center, and people who were in need came and they talked to some of the youth leaders, and then a lot of counselors came and they talked and heard the concerns. Then there was something called the Bear Clan. The Bear Clan was a group, maybe 20 to 30 people, who would just walk the neighborhoods. And anybody who wanted to talk to the people in the Bear Clan would talk. Many of them were indigenous. Winnipeg is 20% indigenous and 40% immigrant. So they did a lot of reconciliation right there. They didn't have to pay anybody. The police department didn't, the police were way in the outskirts. So I think it resolved a lot of issues. I mean, there were issues about kids being stopped by police on biking, for riding a bike on a busy street. I mean, so I just, if you want the phone number and email of Murray Sinclair, I can give it to you. Or maybe I'll get more information of people who head up the Bear Clan. And then I can give you the neighborhood leaders.
Absolutely.
Okay, but I need your contact information too.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Stephanie, what is our email again? Sorry.
Cynthia
No, she's going to give us, she can give you the.
I am standing at the microphone because we had a malfunction with the wireless, but I feel as if we're actually close to a place of conclusion. And the reason I say that is while I was listening, I was trying to clump some of the conclusions that related to each other together. And so let me share with you some of the clumping that I did. That's a technical term.
Totally.
So there was a few that related to essentially missing data. So essentially the conclusion is we are missing data that would help us to better understand the way in which police protect our communities would be one potential conclusion. There were a couple that reflected a conclusion that the Iowa City PD is making concerted efforts to improve their policing of all communities and to reduce bias. There was a desire to see, more detailed information, so same sort of in the same bucket as missing data that's needed. Then there was a set that dealt with the disproportionality, both in terms of stops, in terms of locations, in terms of stops and arrests, and in terms of equity. Then there was a category that referred to both the diversity of the police force being inadequate as well as diversity training perhaps being inadequate. There were a few that were hard for me to categorize or group with each other. There was the one that referred to a need for greater funding of health mixed with one on health impacts, and one that asked for more of a distinction on discretionary and non-discretionary stops. And then there's the call for Kim Reynolds to resign. Not able to put that in any category.
Yes.
It stands alone. What I would submit to you, though, in all sincerity, is it seems like there aren't any conclusions here that are in tension one with the other. It's not like one of you is concluding one thing and the other is concluding the exact opposite. So it feels to me like this could be a good place to sort of put a period or a semicolon and then move into truth-telling Wednesday and Thursday. In other words, you have concluded, I think, and again, this is like a test to you all to see if this sounds right, but you've concluded that you need more information to better understand the true performance of law enforcement. You've concluded that there are unacceptable levels of discrepancy between people of different races that need to be corrected or at least better understood. You've identified a need for more of an effort to diversify the force, the actual police force. You have gotten at the intersection between public safety and health, particularly mental health, and a desire to see more be invested in the health impacts associated with police activity. So, I mean, those to me feel like things that everybody here in one form or another has said and could support. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I don't want you to feel coerced. I want you to feel like what I'm saying satisfies you in terms of a good place to be at this phase of your work. Again, truth-telling is key here. You have to hear testimony to really understand the full complexity of this issue. But if I felt like there were things that needed to be reconciled, I would take you in that direction, but there really aren't. I mean, there's nothing in these suggestions or these conclusions that isn't, in my opinion, pretty well aligned. So I guess my question to you is, as you heard me summarize and sort of put those categories of conclusions, the missing data, the unacceptably high amount of disparity, the need for greater diversification in the force and diversity training, the desire to deal with health. Is there anything in those conclusions that you're not comfortable with as a preliminary?
I'm comfortable.
Seems like we're all comfortable.
I really think that's a good place to be, because I don't want you to go a whole lot farther without hearing people tell you their lived experience, but I also think that this is a good place to be in terms of telling the city council that you've looked at the data and have some, particular feelings about it. So KNW can put some language around this that we would show you before it becomes final to sort of make sure we're articulating it in a way that feels accurate and something you could support. But hopefully the way I've just described it conceptually is enough for you to feel like, yep, that reflects my point of view. I'm comfortable with that being what the TRC has to say at this point.
As you presented the categories of the conclusions and the presentation from the Community Crisis Center, you've made me remember that, especially when you bring up safety and mental health, yes, we are doing well, especially with the strengthening of the Community Crisis Center. At the same time, I've also thought of other non-profits that also help with the safety in our communities. And I've just thought of the organization that our Iowa City office for Eastern Iowa. And I've thought that still along racial and cultural grouping lines, for some, the funding, you really have to go for it, or even health equity and mental health equity along racial and cultural grouping lines. Those groups have to really advocate and fight for that. Yet others, it's already seen, it's the majority culture. It's offered. But for the others, you have really to go after funding. And I've known many that, again and again, it's turned down. Sometimes the reasoning is, you're new, so it goes again. And sometimes the funding even goes to the very people who are even causing the unsafety, and maintaining that unsafety. So those are the thoughts that have come out of me from the categorizations.
There's probably data that could be had about public funding that could be helpful to you. In other words, tracking the kinds of organizations that have received funding from the state, from the federal government, from local and county sources. I don't know as much about how we could track private philanthropy, because that's a little less obvious, but I think the public funding could probably be relatively easy it would take a long time, but it would be findable.
Yeah, or sometimes asking, for example, the organization I run, where does it's one that the mission is eradication of violence in our communities, including Iowa City. So where does our funding come from? State. But we don't have any right now from Iowa City. But I really appreciate us being allowed to have an office in Iowa City. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wanted to just add, I think, as you said, we all can agree that as of right now, all the data that you've gathered, although it's not exhaustive, it's the more formal data that has led to this conclusion we need more data, but I think what we need which I think is very big and glaring, is we need the community data. And I think, not talking to you, Larry, talking to us as commissioners, it's our turn now to start going after that data, whether hopefully in these next couple days we can get other people on board as we listen to their truths so that we can create a committee of people that can help us find that information, like the opinion surveys that you were talking about, Amos, or the information that people aren't going to find in our traditional systems. So I think that is where we as the commission really need to move forward next so that we can make sure that those holes are filled a little bit better. And we might have to create some wheels to get there. But all in all, I want to thank you for bringing and compiling everything, you and Laurel together, because it's helpful for us to see this guide, but we have so much more work to do if we're going to continue on this path, is what I'm seeing.
I certainly agree, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say how meaningful it is to have been able to walk with you this far, and if there are opportunities to walk with you further, we'd welcome that. And you're doing the work that needs to be done. So I salute you for that.
Thank you. And I also want to point out, like you said, Commissioner Gathaway, that we do have our connections to the community, the nonprofits, the lists that we made in the last 2 years that we need to reach out to, especially when community being here. Thanks for the reminder. There's lots of different areas for us to jump into. So this is a great stepping stone.
Well, I would never be able to say my work here is done, because it isn't, but I do think it's probably the right time for me to step back and to say thank you in absentia to Laurel for all of her support to get us here.
Or is she on? Are they on Zoom?
They have been, but the audio's been a little tough, so I will relay to her the thanks, but obviously, as I said the other night, there are a lot of thank yous to go around, but the most important one is to all of you, even that fella over there, and to Commissioner Nobis, who's not physically here, and Commissioner Krebs, who had to step down. It's just hard for me to articulate to you how much of an honor it is to be a part of something like this. So I will still, along with Laurel, work over the next couple of weeks to leave this better than we found it in terms of giving you all a leg up on the rest of the work that you have. But this has been such an incredible ride for us, and so I thank you for allowing us to ride with you through all of this.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Commissioners, do we have any other things we want to discuss or reflect on?
Yes. Larry, even though I've only been here for a month, maybe less than a month in duty here, I would say that I've really, really appreciated your work. Occasionally I poke to you, but I want you to remember that these were not intended to you personally. They were just intended to make our community be better. Yeah, that is what I'm always after. And I've learned a lot from you and the other facilitators. And these questions that we have raised come because you give us a hint. You always give us a hint, and then we look forward. If you are not giving us these hints, I won't know that why is this happening or this is, because we are not experts in criminology. This is not my field. I don't know if it's your field or your field. And there's none of us here whom I know is an expert in criminology and police relations as such. So we are laymen, street men, but the way you poked us with the data, you made us better. And in relation to that, I want to talk about what is difficult to talk about is just the community we live in, and then the police department. Having lived here for over 34 years, getting to 35, I've seen a lot of improvements, and others might have not seen that. So yesterday night, when I didn't sleep very well, I was trying to look at what does that data say regarding my opinion over those 30 years living here from a student who came from Africa. And I feel very positive about my community. I like it. I wouldn't want all my children to get away from here. I want some of them to live around so that they can come and visit me when I want here, because it's a good place. And then On the community, we would just want us to get some opinion about them. Opinions. I go back to what Commissioner Chair says about frequent surveys on what does the community think. Yeah. So sometimes not very good, but it's good to know that. Yeah. And I think on the police department, having gone through the records, I was reading a lot of memorandum from the community members, from researchers and other people, communications. Yeah. I could just have a glimpse, and this is something that nobody's going to tell you unless you read those letters. Their interactions with the researchers, with the community, I feel very positive that we are in a very good place, and they are willing. They are really willing, and sometimes they go out of their way. I mean, the chiefs. I don't know about this other forces, but I think they are supported by the other people. They go their way, and they are very supportive and always working to help make our communities very good. Yeah, that was my opinion. It might be different, and I would want to express that. I don't know how it can come into the document that we're going to say, but it is about truth. I can't be here to say I'm talking about truth when I'm hiding some aspects and I go back home with it in my pocket. Yeah, where some people are doing a good job, we have to say that. And where there are limitations, just like any human being has a limitation, we will say that. I hope they're not going to be mad at it. I think it's for their good. And I saw that signal to me through their communications with other departments and other things. Yeah. But thank you very much, Larry.
I would like to also say thank you for all your hard work and effort. It's been extremely helpful. This is very digestible, easy to digest, and thank you for everything. That's honest God truth from mine. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to say again, thank you. We're going to still hear from you in the next couple weeks, but I appreciate you coming down and giving us this information to the public. I want to open it up to any other public comments. If anyone wanted to say anything that they heard or would like to just, give public comment, please come to the front. If not, I'm going to go ahead and say, this Wednesday and Thursday is our Truth Telling event. We hope that you all will join us. Wednesday is going to be at I-Core Boxing. Thank you again, Cliff. And Thursday is going to be at the James Theater. I would say to my fellow commissioners, as you can see, we have people here, but we need more people than this on Wednesday and Thursday. So I challenge all of us to bring at least 2 to 5 people of our own, if you haven't already invited people, so that we can fill the seats, because the truths matter, but they'll matter more when the community hears it. So I don't know if there's anything else that commissioners would like to say.
Larry, when I heard you mention the word end, I don't do very well with endings, terminations, goodbyes. So I will use a word that somebody told me I can substitute with. We are graduating to the next level. Mm-hmm. And as you end, as I said, I got your memo, and you're saying you're not a fashionista, or you can claim you are. Now you're in the house of fashion. Mm-hmm. So I got the memo, so I twinned with you as you go. Yeah, thank you. But, I'm not good. I don't, so we are graduating to the next level, and I'll stop rambling. Thank you, and it has been a joy working with you. Like I said, for me, you've made a painful topic painless, especially the part of presenting the information. You've presented it in a way I am able to digest and make use of as we continue making my great city even greater. Thank you.
Thank you again. If there's no other further comments, I'm going to move to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you.